Broadcasting live from Youngville, North Carolina and Ontario, Canada, this is Got Mead Live, a weekly show where Vicky Rowe and AJ Airmans bring you the mead news, meadery info, and mead-making discussions from all over, talking with mead makers, mead owners, industry mavens, and influencers. This is Got Mead Live, a weekly podcast about mead and the people who love it and where the mead world is going. And now here are your hosts, Got Mead owner Vicky Rowe and mead and wine maker AJ Airmans.
Live from the den of the puppies of the apocalypse, the Bunny Pen in Ottawa, Canada, Melbourne down under, Ryan's Pad in Denver, and the TARDIS in Miami, it's Got Mead Live. Welcome to the show. We all have to do this on our own time and for free because we're all awesome and stuff. But the software, hardware, and storage all cost money. So we hope you'll consider becoming a supporting patron member. It's only $30 per year, and you get access to much more on gotmead.com. Only a little over 50 cents a week gets you access to the patron boards on Got Mead Forum, our patron Facebook group, and all the award-winning recipes contained in the patron areas. You can listen live on the Got Mead website, or if you're on mobile or want to listen later, check us out on iTunes, SoundCloud, or TuneIn Radio at tunein.com. Search Got Mead Live. Replays right back to the beginning of the show are available on gotmead.com, Spreaker.com, SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher Radio. Just search for Got Mead Live. You can find us at Facebook, facebook.com/Gotmead. You can find us on Twitter at Gotmead Now. If you can't call us, please tweet us. We will keep watching the tweet feed through the show. Making Mead Back to Basics. Check the links on gotmead.com. And you can always call in on 803-443-MEAD. So, what are we drinking tonight, Vicky?
I am working on a rather large bottle that definitely won't get finished tonight from Brimminghorn of We Are Groot, and I just crack up every time I say that. Which I was just informed that is so popular, it's becoming a core product. So if you've had it on tap at Brimminghorn, now, if you're somebody like me who has to drive 7 or 8 hours to get there, you won't have to anymore. All right, so this is a slightly hazy, bright straw-colored mead with a tangy honey aroma, and it's got bog myrtle, tarragon, rosemary, and juniper berries. It's in a wildflower honey with ale yeast. And it comes together as a slightly sweet, honey-laced, citrusy, bright, little herby, but not like green herbal. It's more like a bright, spicy herbal flavor, and it's it would be the most awesome summer drinker. I could totally get down with like a whole 6-pack of this at the beach, no problem at all. And if you want to get some, it's brimminghornmeadery.com. Just go check them out. They usually have this. If they have it, it's on tap right now, but they will be getting it bottled at some point in the future. I don't know when yet, so can't help you there. But it's really good. You should drink some.
And Hamish, what have you got?
Oh, all right. I'm drinking a rather special orange blossom honey from Honey Pot Meadery. Alex down there in California actually gave it to me last year. And it's rather special because the honey came off the orange groves in the middle of the big drought they were having there, and so the only water that the bees could get was directly out of the flowers. So it's a very different flavor to what you would normally expect from a mead, or from an orange blossom, I should say. It's very concentrated and strong in the orange flavors, and yeah, it's wonderful.
That's cool. I've got one of my Chateau Chevette traditional meads. This is the one that I brought out to the Mazer Cup, and it's this is the bottle that was at the end of the batch, so it's a little bit cloudy, but the rest of them were clear. And it's goldenrod with a little bit of buckwheat in it, and if I sniff it, I can sort of tell the buckwheat's there, and a couple of other people at Mazer Cup actually guessed right on exactly what honey it was, so I guess it's a pretty fair representation of what I put in it. Started it in 2015, bottled it just before Mazer Cup, and it seems to be holding up pretty well, given that I've had this half bottle kicking around for a couple of days.
Wait, is this the one that had like the gazillion bottles?
Yeah, this was a 5-gallon batch. It was the apple one was the one where I had like almost 70 bottles.
Yeah.
No, this was the one that a couple of people came back for seconds for that I was kind of impressed about.
Oh, nice.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice.
Yeah, this was definitely not one of my bad examples, although I did bring some of those.
So who do we have on tonight?
We've got a friend of AJ's. So AJ, would you like to do the honors?
Sure. We've got Steven Snudden coming on. Sorry, Snudden. He's.
I was just gonna say, didn't he tell us it was like sudden?
I know. This is what happens when I try to think and do something at the same time. It doesn't work. I'm sorry, Steve. Steven Snudden. He's from Kingston, Ontario, and he's associated with the brew clubs down there. And he's been doing some experiments and posting them up on his website, experimeads.com. He's been the reason he contacted me originally is because he wanted me to be a part of his Great Canadian Yeast Experiment, where he took a bunch of different yeasts and put them in the same honey must, and then did triangle tests with a bunch of different people from different places. And he did this with the Kingston Brew Club. I think he sent some out to BC, and he brought some over to my place. And I had a couple of my friends who, one of them's a wine connoisseur and the other one is a beer brewer. And they came out, and hopefully we gave him some good data. And I guess we can let him introduce the rest of it once we get him in.
Cool.
We'll get him in here, we'll get him in here in a second. So I think it's really interesting that he's doing this because there's not all that many studies being done, and and it's I think one of the things that Steven said was that he kind of was like looking for that and wasn't finding much. And there's a few studies, but really not very much. So this kind of stuff is really needed.
Yeah, I think the biggest one that he found was Bray's search for his bomb yeast. That was probably one of the better documented experiments with different kinds of yeasts that was out there.
Yeah, I've seen it. Steven, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So we were just talking about, how your frustration with lack of formalized study of mead led to experimeads, and and that's so cool that that's happening. I was just on the site looking around, and I had to force myself off the site. And I hope you don't mind if after the show I share all of that to all my social media.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thank you. There's going to be some people really interested in seeing that. I think this is really cool. So tell us, tell us a little bit about you first. I mean, we know, but they don't. And then, kind of what led you to this place of starting to do this, and then, how you decided to set things up.
Yeah, so I am the type of person where I'll always give something a shot once. And when I travel, I love just trying new dishes or new drinks and beverages that are local to that destination. And when I heard about mead, I had no idea what it was. And, I couldn't get it in Ontario where I live. And so the only option for me was to make and so it's actually been a pretty short time for me. I've just been making mead for about 1.5 years now. But in that process, I've made just about every type of mead with every honey, fruit, and strength, about 1 gallon or 2 a week, or a batch or 2 a week. And just really just trying to explore that. And in the process, I was quite frustrated by the lack of evaluating studies and controlled studies. There has been some work out there, but it's nothing like you would see in the wine or beer world. For example, Billy Belt's study on ale yeasts is probably one of the best experiments that's out there, looking at ale yeast in a particular strength of mead. And I wanted to really, for my first experiment, kind of focus on comparing yeasts for short meads. Short meads is a style of mead I really prefer. And when you're looking at a mead that's 5-6% alcohol, it's really hard to get that mouthfeel and the flavor to come through that you can in more of the standard strength meads. So I ran the test and did try to do my research, and just trying to get that data out there, just trying to promote mead and quantitative evaluation of mead.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And there aren't too many people trying to do that, as you say. So it's a pretty awesome thing that you're trying to get done. AJ said that she's done some tastings with you before. What was that for?
So that was for the first experiment that was done. So basically what I did is there's been a number of studies comparing yeast for mead that have been done in the past. So for example, Billy Belts did one, Braden Ard has done a bunch, in his search for the bomb. And then there's a bunch going back that were done on Basic Brewing Radio. And so I took kind of the best of those yeasts, and some of the major yeasts that are used right now in meaderies across the states, like US05, B47, and really just wanted to put them up against each other. So in that experiment, what we basically did is we made about an 8% traditional mead from all the different yeasts. And then really the evaluation was looking at how quickly the yeasts produce a mead that can mature quickly and produce good amounts of mouthfeel and what sort of aroma and taste profiles you're going to get out of those yeasts. So the meads were sent across Canada. So Toronto, Vancouver, Kingston, and AJ up in Ottawa were all kind enough to spend a lot of time doing triangle tests and writing descriptors and giving their rankings of different meads. That was, I think, very insightful. We got a lot of pretty good data from that, which I can talk about. Part of the purpose of starting the triangle tests is really you're testing people's ability to perceive differences across mead. And if you're familiar with brewing, you're going to be familiar with Brewslam website. And basically, it's this whole website devoted where every week they're running multiple experiments, doing triangle tests with different methods of brewing beer. And that has provided a phenomenal amount of information in terms of, what are the things that are, sort of passing people's taste thresholds, what sort of things, may matter, but people aren't generally able to pick up in their in triangle tests, which is important information. But I kind of wanted to go one step further and, actually ask information about, if you did perceive a difference between the meads, which one did you prefer, why, what aroma, and taste description did you pick up in the different meads? And boy, there's a huge difference. So
that's pretty crazy. What sort of parameters did you set for yourself? I mean, in terms of keeping the baseline, your control, and and the experimentation, and how are you tracking your results?
Right. So basically, the yeast everything was kept constant, except for the yeast used. Let me just pull it up here. Yeah. And then, yeah, and so the purpose of well, actually, I should say that one of the difficulties with conducting these triangle tests with so many different meads is you had to pair them off. So, so for example, I was really interested in comparing, for example, like different strains of the California ale yeast. So like 1056, US05, and 001. And I really had to, choose which ones were going to be paired off in the triangle test. But I also wanted an overall feel of just ranking quantitatively. So I was able to record how people ranked in terms of overall and aroma and flavor descriptors. I probably doesn't answer your question very well.
Actually, no.
When you say,
sorry, go ahead, Hamish.
When you say pairing, what do you mean by pairing when you say that?
Right. So in a triangle test, basically what you have is you lay out 3 meads in front of someone, and you say one of these meads is not like the other. And the taster will taste all 3, and they'll have to decide which mead is the odd one out. And
is that to say 2 poured from the same bottle, you mean?
Right. So one of the meads is going to be poured twice. One of the meads is going to be poured once. They're going to be presented blindly to the participant, and they're going to have to identify the odd one out. Now, if you're actually collecting information on taste and overall experience and everything, I mean, this can take like 20 to 40 minutes per triangle test. I mean, people are going to want to taste every mead 2 or 3 times. And, I was working with 12 meads, 12 different types of yeast on the same must, fermented exactly the same way. And I should really talk about some of the parameters of the study. But I think it was Bray in his review of his peer review of the study said, the triangle tests are interesting, but I'm quite interested in what people perceive the aroma to be. I mean, these meads were sent to the major homebrew brew clubs across Canada. They were evaluated by BJCP, Mead, and beer judges and experienced homebrewers of mead. So, every metric that I recorded kind of surprisingly gave, a different angle on the conclusion.
So the basis behind the triangle test was what? Just to make sure that people's taste was calibrated so that they could tell the difference between one and the other before they tried marking them?
The purpose of the triangle test is to really see if people can tell the difference. Whether, normally if I was to conduct a scientific paper on fermentation and try to publish it in a peer-reviewed journal, it's going to contain a detailed analysis of the aromatic chemicals that are contained within the different the meads. But for a triangle test, really the purpose is seeing if there are differences. They're different yeasts, so they're going to produce different chemical components. The fermentations are going to be slightly different. But the real question is whether or not people can identify the difference between 2 yeasts. So if I give you US05 and D47, don't tell you which one is which, can you tell me which one was fermented with US05 versus D47?
Well, Yeah, I think I see what you mean. It's about a scientific control, basically. If you were going to put a glass of D47 and a glass of USO5 in front of me and tell me that one was this and one was that, which one's which, I got a 50% chance of getting it right, whether I can taste or not. But if you tell me that two are one and one is the other, and I've got to choose which one, then you're actually controlling for the person who's to prove that they really can taste the difference, and it's not some subjective thing. You're actually picking out the actual difference.
Right, and then it's a question of statistics, because if a person can pick out the difference, that doesn't mean anything. Because if I gave 3 people the triangle test, and everybody just guessed randomly, 1 out of 3 on average would get it right. And so
Correct.
The purpose of this is to get as many participants as possible, and then you can see how many people were right and compare that to random chance guessing.
So what were your findings based on, just for the triangle testing, depending on whether someone was, a wine or a beer or a mead maker?
Yeah, see, this is really interesting because with the Brewslam guys, they got a lot of criticism, basically saying a lot of their experiments were showing up insignificant. And one of the criticisms was that, well, you're just using home brewers, and if you had actual proper trained judges, you'd get more significant results. But when they looked at their data, they were finding that there was really no correlation, whether you're a BJCP judge or just a good home brewer. It didn't make any difference whether or not you could guess correctly in a triangle test. But for the mead experiment, there was a huge correlation. There was definitely a significant correlation between people who had experience with meads, who brewed meads, who were mead judges, versus non-mead makers or non-mead judges. So even if you're a BJCP beer judge, it doesn't mean you're any better at identifying the odd meads out. But the really, I can say that, for example, AJ identified every single mead correctly in the triangle test. And that was true for some of the very experienced mead makers in my homebrew club. And in even certain cases where there was, just looking at the data now, about half of the triangle tests had above 80% correct responses. So it means that more than 2/3 of the people, for example, were able to correctly identify the meads. So most of the triangle tests actually came out significant. The only one that didn't was comparing 71B with EC 1118. And then a couple of the other ones that really didn't have enough of sample size.
Does that mean you draw the conclusion then that 71B and EC 1118 are very similar in the way they ferment, or did you say you didn't have a big enough sample size to tell?
I mean, the p-value on it was 0.104. So, it kind of depends on, as an applied economist, I look at that number and say, well, given that sample size, that's pretty good. But, if you're hardcore stats, you're going to look at that and say, well, it's not 0.05, so it's not significant. But
right.
I still, and I still think there's information there. And I think more importantly, out of those people who correctly identified 71B out of EC 1118, 6 out of the 7 preferred 71B. And so, I did this let me just I'll just go through some of the triangle tests. So for example, for short meads, for me, it was always a question. One of the biggest things that was of interest to me was comparing D47 with USO5, because those are sort of two common strains that are used for short meads. And out of the 17 triangle tests, 10 correctly identified the odd mead out, which gave a p-value of 0.027, which was significant. But out of those 10, 6 preferred D47 to USO5, which wasn't significant. So what it means is that, even though people could tell the difference, it wasn't, the preference was split. And that was pretty much consistent across the triangle test that we did. Some people really preferred some of the fruity character of some of the more English ale strains. Some people prefer the cleaner honey notes that came from sort of the California ale yeasts. Overall, after the triangle conducted, like I said, I collected information on like overall ranking, and those generally coincided pretty closely with some of the previous studies from Billy Belts. So, for example, 001 performed was the most preferred mead overall, both in terms of aroma, flavor, and overall preference. And particularly the ale yeasts did perform very, very well in overall preference.
So in this this test that you have with the three glasses of mead, you have two of one type of mead and you have one of a different type. Did you when you put the same two meads before multiple different judges, were they all given two of the EC118, or was that random in itself?
So that was random, and in fact,
okay.
I've learned a couple of things just doing the triangle tests. First, they take a while, so yeah. There's going to be no more comparing 12 different meads. Comparing two meads is you get a lot of information. It takes less than half an hour time, and I think that's sort of the way to go. Second, you want to do all your meads, all your triangle tests at the same place at the same time. So this is kind of one of my, I think, bigger criticisms of brewlosophy. And one of the things that they do is, someone shows up to your garage and you give them a triangle test, and then a week later someone else shows up to your garage and you give them another triangle test. But as we all know, meads, age, their character changes, just conditions, pouring conditions change, so it really, even though to try to get a really high sample size, I sent the meads all across Canada to try to get as many BJCP judges as I could. It's really not the best design. Like, for example, I shipped the meads in a case of 12 to Toronto, and then, not more than 48 hours later, they evaluated the meads. Well, these are bottle conditioned short meads, and some of the meads were low flocculating, didn't have a chance to settle out. And so Toronto had a kind of a tough time of that. Whereas, in Kingston, here I was able to control a lot better. Even when I drove to Toronto, just driving up to Toronto kind of showed the meads up a bit and created a bit of a difference. And so for example, for my second experiment that I did it at Canada's largest homebrew competition, where, during a break, I set up the triangle tests, and try to wrangle as many people as I could. And in that case, everybody's doing it all at once. Everything's controlled. I'm randomizing which glass people get. Because another thing can happen is like you get a group, let's say of 3-6 people in a room, and someone says, oh, I think this one's the odd one out, and it's just like, oh, don't say that. You might influence other people's opinion. But, if someone has 2 of one and the other person has 2 of the other, and people know that, it's less likely to influence people's opinion.
Okay. Now, so if you were to do that and you were to, sit us all down in the room and you were to give AJ 2 of this one and me 2 of that one and Vicky 2 of I don't know, one other random ones or whatever, did you record then who got 2 of which and who got 1 of which?
So what I did, the way I designed it, is I assigned every mead a color and a shape. And I put them in the red solo cups, and I attached a sticker to the bottom of the solo cup so that they couldn't identify the color or shape. And I told participants not to look at the bottom of the cups. So then what would happen is they would say, okay, this I think is the odd mead out. And so they say, okay, I'm ready to make my guess. So I go over, they lift up all 3 cups and they see if they correctly got the odd one out. So it could have been, for example, yellow triangle versus black circle. And if they see they got the odd one out. And if they did get the odd one out, then I would ask them to fill out the descriptor sheets.
Yeah. And so you recorded which mead was the odd one out for each person?
I didn't need to because I could tell which one was, whether or not they got it correct or not.
I was interested.
And then which one they preferred.
I was interested to see if the one they preferred correlated to the number of samples they had. So if they had 2 glasses of this one, did they prefer that over the one they only had 1 glass of?
I'm pretty sure having taken the test, it didn't make any difference.
Okay.
Well, she's saying that because she's a pro. She got all of them correct. I mean, if you can tell the difference, it's pretty obvious. The one thing about it though is that, if there was an experiment where one of the meads would just say a lot sweeter or a lot more acidic, someone got 2 really acidic meads and 1 less acidic mead, that could, if they're tasting it multiple times, it could cause more palate fatigue. And so, the idea is that if you're sort of equally or randomizing who gets 2, that should sort of come out in the wash, the statistics.
Okay.
Honestly, I found I was able to identify them mostly by smell, not as much by taste. But that was me.
Yeah.
And the thing I found with trying to figure out which one I liked better was most of them I didn't. The preference was not really that pronounced, is what I found with the ones that I got a chance to taste.
Okay.
And I didn't find out until way later which one it was that, I found D47, I got that one up twice, and both times I detected a multi-character to it. And I thought that was really interesting because I never noticed that when I've made anything myself.
Yeah, and part of that is the parameters of the experiment. So, so let me just kind of take a step back. And so the starting gravity was 1064. It was fermented dry, so you're looking at just over 8% ABV. They're pretty high carbonate water profile, and the nutrient regime was Go-ferm, rehydrated in Go-ferm using an activated starter for 2 to 3 hours. Then staggered additions of ferment oat and K. And over the first 24 hours. And I used a white honey. So I get white honey around here means kind of a clover alfalfa early very water white honey. So I really wanted the honey to sort of be light enough that any ester or yeast character would really come through. And so I think the key thing here, actually probably one of the most important things other than the nutrient profile, is the fact that these meads were fermented at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're really at the optimal range for ale yeasts and not potentially wine yeasts. And this was a common parameter that I chose to be consistent with Billy Belt's experiment. And like, for example, right now I'm drinking a clone of Chaos Sizer from Grunfell Meadery, and it's fermented with D47 at 86 degrees Fahrenheit, way out of its temperature range. But it gives you exactly what you would want from it, which is, this nice bright acidity. It's got all this malty character with mouthfeel. The yeast character really supports the honey profile. And for a 6% mead, it's got a whole lot going on. You would have thought it was, a standard strength. And so, if you took the same experiment and did it at 62 degrees, you'd probably get very different results.
Well, it's definitely an idea for the next experiment, is trying a bunch of these different things with, all the same yeasts, all the same honey, and change the temperature and see what comes out different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the experiments I'd like to do in the future, especially sort of comparing 001, which was really the winner in this experiment, to let's say D47 or 71B again, and just see how strong the preferences are, or if the strength of the preference still remain. So one of the AJ, like you mentioned, really one of the differences was in the aroma, and I think that is definitely that it really came across in a lot of the meads, if there's no other questions, I'd like to kind of talk about some of the aroma descriptors that we were getting from the different yeasts.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, please.
Cool. So D47, multiple people said malty. AJ was definitely one of the first people I heard use that descriptor, but a lot of the other people in Toronto, Vancouver also found that. They also found an apple character, a palm fruit character come from it. Not green apple like acetaldehyde, but definitely more of classic kind of light pear apple. But the honey character was noticeable but muddled. EC11, people thought it was kind of funky and had some banana. It wasn't a particular favorite. 71B was described as fruity with some orange character and some clear honey notes, but also a very wine-like character. Cote de Blanc was the least favorite, probably, of all the dry wine yeasts. Chemical sulfur was a common descriptor. T58, people just said a lot of green apple, acetaldehyde, a lot of white wine character, very little honey character. So that's a dry ale yeast. CBC1, which is a yeast that's been highlighted by Braden Nard, came in quite favorably. People thought it had a low level of honey character and a lot of green apple, kind of white wine-like character. But the ones that I thought and other people thought really made the honey character shine were the really clean California ale strains. So USO5 was described with clear honey character, very cider-like, very apple-like character. And, USO5, 001, and 1056 are technically should be the same produced, or should be the same yeast, but they've been harvested at different times and grown under different conditions, and there is a possibility that over time the yeast strains are going to diverge slightly, and it's kind of a debate common in the beer world. And definitely it was something that was found in this experiment for mead. So for example, 001 was noted to have a lot more honey character and a lot more floral character, and less cider and apple-like, which described USO5. And in 1056 was very surprisingly had a
Have we still got you there?
Hello?
No, I think
He's
he
still
dropped
there.
us. He dropped
Sorry,
us.
on my phone. Yeah, I dropped my phone.
Life
Wonder
happens.
Yeah.
Ow.
So you were saying 1056 had...
Yeah, 1056 had an incredible amount of fruit character. A lot of people described it as like blueberry-like, a lot of wine, more lighter on the honey, more fruit-forward, like grape. So, and this was something I noticed immediately. Like you can smell it. And it was just like a fruit bomb, just like berries, which is, very interesting compared to 001, which was just, and 1056, which really emphasized the honey character, a lot clearer and a lot more. And fruity also came through with the more English strains, like 002 and 041. Both of those, like 002 was seen quite favorably. It had a lot of floral, fruity, apple, passion fruit. 041, which I think was Billy Belt's favorite, was mainly described as fruity, quite clearly. So a lot of people really like that character. And
excuse me, AJ and I are both scribbling down furiously in this
Yeah,
episode.
Yeah, so
it's
like they're
all
taking all
online.
these notes, right?
There's really no need. I mean, on experimeads, like there's tables and tables of descriptors and quantitative statistics from this study. So, I tried to highlight the descriptors, like the descriptor, if it was used once or if it was used multiple times. But that same character really comes through with D47 in the flavor. So when it came to flavor, D47, again, a lot of green apple and malty. A lot of the wine yeast kind of gave that white wine character. People kept describing it as white wine. This is also true of USO5. People described it as sort of balanced, kind of tannic white wine, cider floral-like. Whereas like 1056 and 001 had much more honey and pronounced floral. In flavor, 1056 didn't have as much fruit, but had more of the green apple character, whereas 041 was still very fruity.
So experimeads is your website, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. So how long's that been running? That's for people at home. That's experimeads, experimeads.com. It'll be in the show links for this episode. How long have you had that website up?
About 6 months, ever since I've had actually at the end of last summer, but ever since I had this, the data for the experiment, I wanted to post it, make it publicly available. the idea behind experimeads is really very similar to brewology. So I keep mixing up brewology and brewlosophy. They're two. One's a BJCP Mead or BJCP beer podcast. The other one's the website where they do the triangle test. But the idea is really just to create an outlet. And my hope is I'm going to be continuing these experiments and triangle tests. And I really encourage other people to conduct these experiments, even if it's as simple as when you're bottling, try 2 different priming trigger methods. As long as it kind of meets the criteria for a controlled study, and this could be a really good avenue for really great way for increasing information, because really it's important to conduct these controlled studies, but it's also important to repeat them. And the hope is to kind of really encourage people to provide that information. So if we've done the yeast experiment, we did another experiment with short meads where we looked at acid additions and how that changed aroma and flavor descriptors. But another section of the website is devoted to evaluated mead recipes. So every possible parameter that could affect the fermentation is attempted to be described. Then, and every step of the process. And then when score sheets come back from certified mead judges, that information can be made available to people. So not only can people see every step from water profile, temperature, rehydration methods, every time you gassed and the nutrient profile you used, and then read every descriptor from the BJCP mead judges. That was sort of the one thing that when I first started, I was, it was controlled studies, but it was also, someone says, I really like this type of mead, you should use this yeast and this nutrient. But the question in the back of my mind was, okay, well, is this person, just a super taster? Is this person, is that just their preference, or is this a general preference? Is this something that's going to appeal to people generally? Is it something that's going to appeal to judges? And so I think, for example, all the Mazer Cup winners recently probably have these amazingly detailed records of the recipes that they, their recipes and their procedures, and being able to have that available with the score sheets. And, this is kind of the big thing, right? The score sheets contain praises and criticisms, so you have to be willing to share both. Can really be a valuable data point for people. And enough of these are shared, people are going to have a very good idea of, what quantities of fruit and what levels of acidity and what residual sweetnesses are going to do well, right? So, that's sort of a kind of the idea behind it all. And my hope is that if you're listening and you have very detailed information on your procedures and methods, and evaluated score sheets, is you can share it and make it available, on experimeads, on Got Mead. This stuff is, I don't do this for me. I do this for community, and so hopefully in the future they're going to take on some collaborators and be an outlet for experiments. And if you do conduct an experiment with your homebrew club or get it evaluated at a mead judging event, it's all an opportunity for you to get some feedback, because all of the experiments that are going to be posted on the site are going to have 2 peer-reviewed referees. blind or not, that are going to be able to provide constructive criticism on experiment design and execution. So, for example, on the first one where we compared yeasts, Braden, Ard, and AJ both provided their comments and criticisms of the experiment, which I think was phenomenally helpful.
So, for you had the Great Canadian Yeast Experiment. If anybody was going to want to have the Great American Yeast Experiment or the Great Michigan Yeast Experiment, if you want to do it a bit smaller, or the Great Australian Yeast Experiment, something
because
along
that's
those
where
lines.
he's really going with this.
If they were to go to experimeads.com, are they going to find like an idiot's guide to running a triangle test? Have you got anything like that? How to be rigorous in running these in order to have it meet the criteria that you want it to meet, that you will publish it?
Yes, and I have a draft ready, but I'm haven't posted the article yet. But yeah, that's the hope, both for the experiments section and the evaluated recipe section, that there's going to be a criteria. You're going to have to catalog everything from water profiles and rehydration methods and every time you touched it, basically. And the things that I was mentioning earlier about randomizing the meads in the triangle test and conducting the experiment at once and getting a certain number of people to participate would all be part of the criteria.
So we've got a question from David Webb on one of the chats. Have you done any experimenting with DV10 or the Vierka dry mead yeast?
I have not, but that sounds like a great experiment if you want to do it.
Well, I know he's
for
been
it,
using
David.
Vierka for a while. I haven't actually seen DV10 in my brew store yet. I'd have to order it, and I don't know where he gets the Vierka, but he's been really enamored with that one himself, so I'm sure that's why he was asking.
Yeah, and that's a very easy experiment to conduct, really. If you just compare two yeasts, I mean, if you're conducting a triangle test with just two meads, it really doesn't take that long to get your evaluations. It's mostly in the organization and, the recording of the data and the evaluation of the data. And, hopefully that's something that a service that I can provide guidance on statistics and generating data analysis. That's something that, kind of is there. So, if you're running experiments and you have questions about how you calculate p-values and stuff like that, I mean, it'd be a good resource to contact if you want help with that.
One of the other questions I had was, you said you used a very light honey. Did you find that the color was indistinguishable between the different meads, or did you have to disguise the color from the tasters so they couldn't use that to differentiate?
Have you been reading the article?
They all look the same.
Okay.
That's not quite true. I have a photo about a third of the way down the article where I actually show 1056 and compare it to US-05. And one of the things that people don't necessarily realize is that the Y-yeast smack packs aren't gluten-free because they contain an activator that has wort in it, beer wort.
Okay.
And so when the meads were fermented and flocculated, the 1056 was noticeably darker than the US-05 and 001. But because I was pouring people just a couple ounces in red solo cups, they weren't clear glasses. No one mentioned that to me. It was easier to notice when it was in the 1 gallon carboy, but when you're just pouring a couple ounces, the color difference wasn't as pronounced.
Yeah, it's possible
Okay.
it might have been noticeable if you'd put it in wine glasses, but I don't know if I can't remember if I had 1056 or not in any of the tests that you brought over to my place, but I don't remember ever seeing a color difference in any of them.
The other thing is, according to Rydell and all those people who like to charge a lot of money for their glassware, it changes the flavour a lot depending on what you drink from. Would you recommend that we go out and find red solo cups in order to do this, or can we choose our own glassware?
I think you could even conduct an experiment on glassware, right? If you really
that would
wanted
be
to
a
show
great
it.
experiment, because there's a lot of somebody commented on the Got Mead group earlier today when I posted the link, going, cue all of the glass snobs versus the people that are willing to do this in plastic, and I kind of gave him a little bit of shit for it, because I was like, no snarky allowed in here. But he's right. I mean, realistically speaking, he is right. There are people who will just sneer down their nose at anything that isn't in the very best of glass. And, glass snobs, I guess you could call them. That's what he called them, and he's right. But yeah.
Being an engineer and not a scientist, I would love to know how you would try and put together an experiment on glassware, because wouldn't it kind of be obvious that you were drinking from a different glass? You couldn't do a triangle test because those two look the same and that one doesn't.
Well, what you do then is
you've
got two meads that are the same color, and you put one in one glass and then the other in the same glass and a different glass, or 3 different glasses, and see if you can tell the difference.
I see. So you're still saying 2 different meads, and okay.
I mean, it's the triangle test. I think the usefulness of that is in being able to tell the difference. It sort of gives you an idea of whether the person's senses are subtle enough to be able to figure out the difference between, pick out the one that doesn't match. Right?
Well, the only difficulty with that is that if you change the glassware and the mead, then you would have 2 variables that are different.
Yeah.
Well, then, okay, I guess you'd have to do a quad test then.
Yeah.
2 different glasses, 2 different meads, pick out which 2 go together.
Or what if you took 2 different meads and just added a drop of food coloring in one and put it in clear glasses, or versus giving it to people in solo red solo cups where they couldn't see the color.
Yeah, I suppose that giving them the same mead with one has food coloring in it, if you've got a food coloring that doesn't have a flavor to it, then that would be as valid a test. Is there a difference between these 2, yes or no?
I've also seen it where they've taken the glassware, if they've got glassware, or if it's just a see-through thing, and wrapped it in such a way that you couldn't see through it.
Right.
And if necessary, blindfold the tasters so they can't look into the glass. Because what you see is, even if it's a solo cup and you're still looking down into it, it's still going to be influenced by that. And Bjorn's being a smart arse. He says, "How about a tumbler, a nosing glass, and a brandy glass, or the bottom cutting of 2-liter bottles and a cat dish?"
Well, then what you do is you put the same mead in all 3 of them, dye them 3 different colors, and say, "Can you pick out the different one?" And if they can't, then they're good. And if then they're making shit up.
Then you know that they're eye tasters.
Either that, or the glass does actually make a difference. So that's a really difficult one to figure out how to do.
Yeah, I think it'd be really hard to control for does the glass make a difference.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think this what really comes down to is the limitations of a triangle test. Because, if you have more than one treated group, you're going to need more observations to be able to find significance. You're going to have to test each variable at one time, or try to use a different metric. So you could provide, an alternative way of doing it, which may, be is just a different methodology. Would just be, to present people with a flight. and ask them if there's a difference, right? Which, is just different, right? And there's a number of limitations of triangle tests in general that, and so, for example, I have an experiment coming up where I make a kind of a Gold Coast meadery kind of 12% mead using USO5, fermented dry as my control. But then I have 3 treated meads where I inoculate them with different souring methods. So for one, I use kombucha, another one I use probiotic pills, and another one I used a ginger bug. And really the interest there in that experiment is not, can people tell the difference? Because let me tell you, you can tell a difference between, a ginger bug and a traditional, or, kombucha and, a lactic. It's pretty obvious. But really the interest there is going to be what aroma and flavor descriptors are people using to describe it. And then getting, even just simple quantitative input, such as, from 1 to 5, how would you rate this mead? Which one do you prefer out of the 4? Rank them accordingly. That is still, a valid method and is definitely more appropriate for that type of experiment.
So if you got anything else to say about arranging experiments then, like making sure you have a control, that type of thing?
Other than what I've said so far, I'll probably post a piece pretty soon on that, and how to properly design a triangle test. I think the key thing here is kind of keep it simple, make sure there's only one variable changed, try only to do one triangle test at a time. Palate fatigue is a real thing. When in this experiment we did with where I basically took a Grunfell style mead, like the Psychopomp clone, and where basically, I'm using D47. It was a 5.5% ABV mead. It was fermented on Polish sour cherries, and it was fermented at 86 degrees. And what I did is I treated half of the sample with acid, I think citric acid, and some of the sample without citric acid, and presented it to 15 BJCP beer and mead judges. And for that experiment, I did it during a break where we just got off evaluating IPAs. And luckily I had asked in my questionnaire, from 1 to 5, like, how blown is your palate from, I'm stewarding, I haven't drank anything today, to, I just finished 10 flights of IPAs, being 5. And yeah, there's a definite correlation there between the people who, describe their palate as being exhausted, were definitely had a lot more difficulty evaluating the meads. And so I think it can come in the case too, where if you're sitting down with a group of people and you're doing 3, 4, or 5 triangle tests, after a while they just sort of all start tasting the same. It gets harder and harder. So the order in which you conduct the triangle tests will matter in that case. But that second experiment that I did with acid additions, I thought that was really interesting because I guess one thing I haven't mentioned about kind of optimal design of these triangle tests is that you really want participants to be blind to the treatment, So what that means is, like, in the yeast experiment, the participants really knew that it was different yeasts, right? So they were looking for, things that would distinguish yeasts. Whereas in the second experiment I did, no one knew what the treatment was, which was acid, and out of the 15 participants, only 3 were mead judges, because that's sort of the state of mead in Canada. And the mead judges definitely had a much better time identifying the odd mead out. 2/3 of them got it correct versus 1/3 for the beer judges. And part of that is because, for a beer judge, so much of your focus is on, malt character, the bitterness, sweetness balance. Whereas for mead, you have that acidity really playing a key role there, very much like cider making. And acidity isn't really something that beer judges are really looking for when they're evaluating beers. So,
wonder how different that would have been with wine judges.
Yeah, probably quite different.
Because I think acidity is probably something you're looking for in wine.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and so I guess, is there any more questions about those 2 experiments?
Nothing coming in on the feed right now.
Okay.
If you'd like to talk more about BJCP in Canada, I'm interested in hearing about it.
Yeah, so there isn't a lot of mead judges in Canada up at about a year ago. And last year there was a big push to do a lot of mead courses in Canada, so to get qualifications for the tasting exam. And, one of the things they say about Canada is it's about 1/10 of the size of the States.
Population-wise, yeah.
Yeah, population-wise, GDP-wise, and when it comes to mead, it's kind of no exception.
Yeah.
Like, there's kind of like one, decent meadery in Ontario that I would, score above 30 and actually give a medal to in a competition. And, it's that, it's where
I think you have a total of 4 to choose from in Ontario.
Exactly, right. Where I was just in Michigan over the holidays and, did a tour of, Strands and Cellarmans and B Nectar, and it was totally different scene, right? So,
right.
But last year, we were very fortunate to have a national level judge, Kathy, who traveled across Canada and conducted these mead tasting exams. And so both Toronto and Vancouver had tasting exams. So there are definitely, 10 times the amount of mead judges in Canada this year than last year. It's kind of sad, right? Like, when you write the tasting exam as a mead judge, you're compared to your peers, but also the 2 highly ranked judges, which sort of serve as the control. And usually, these are grandmaster, national level judges. And when I wrote my tasting exam last year, this is a grandmaster national level beer judge, but neither of them had their mead designation. So, which was important because we were having all sorts of honey varietals, from Australian varietals and canola honey, and Ontario wildflower honey and buckwheat honey, and it was kind of clear that there wasn't a familiarity because for a lot of people, when they get a dry mead, they say, well, this doesn't really taste like honey. They mean like it does not sweet, right?
Yeah.
They're not necessarily know what to look for. What sort of character are you going to get out of, goldenrod versus, a white lighter honey. I think just like, And that's one of the things I noticed too with when I submit to competitions, that the quality of the feedback you get from mead judges is an order of magnitude better than from a beer judge. Like a dry, short mead, a beer judge, they'd be like, "What is this? It's not sweet. This isn't honey. What's going on here? It's so confusing. What's this acidity?" Whereas a mead judge, it's easier to, they'd be more accustomed to that. And, in Canada, we have about a dozen or so major competitions. And of those, where they accept, six, sort of probably around 500 plus entries. And that's across the BJCP categories. But only about 2/3 of those competitions accept mead. And what that means is that in these competitions in Canada, all of the meads get lumped together in one category, right? Everything from dry short meads to sweet fruit bombs are being compared.
So especially if anybody doesn't know what they're tasting for, the sweet are gonna win out over the dry any day, right?
Right. I mean, that's just going to be general preference, especially when you're just taking tiny sips, and evaluating character. You're going to get a lot more honey character from a 12% than a 6%.
Yeah.
And, this is something, that's, if you really want that feedback and the quality of judging, you're going to have to submit to Mazer Cup or Mead for Your Die or some of the other major competitions in the States, which is very hard to do from Canada, because one year I was trying to submit to Mead for Your Die, and I was running around to all the different couriers trying to find someone who would take my package of mead, and UPS turned me down, and FedEx turned me down, and
Did you try just going across the bridge to Ogdensburg and seeing if they'd take it from there?
Well,
oh God.
I think it was. I think Pure Litter eventually took it, but because they're concerned that at some point the U.S. Postal Service is going to touch it, that they get in trouble. Maybe they have less control over that internet. But anyway, kind of coming back to the Canadian judging scene, it's it's difficult because you're comparing across this wide variety of meads, and even as a judge, sometimes it's unclear, when you get a 6%, hydromel, this wonderful short mead, if you're not familiar, if there's no commercial examples available of very high quality short meads, there's no benchmark at which to evaluate, and your benchmark is then going to be all the other meads in the flight. Right. So I think, fortunately, given the number of mead judges that we have now, things will probably pick up in the next couple of years and improve.
Well, we've already got one asking. Bjorn wants to know, how does he get involved with the BJCP in Canada, and he's also asking about proximity to, probably your proximity to Vancouver, BC. I think he's in Ottawa, Bjorn, but...
Kingston.
Or
close
Kingston,
to Ottawa,
sorry,
but not quite.
in Ontario.
We're
anyway.
Ontario.
Yeah. But yeah, so how can other Canadians who are interested get involved? Does it just go to bjcp.org, or do you guys have something set up there?
No, that's right. Internationally, the answer, even within the U.S., is go to the bjcp.org. Do your online exam, where I think it's 200 questions in 60 minutes. Once you pass that, you can sign up for the tasting exam, and that's really the difficulty. If you live in the prairies or not close to Toronto or a major city, is just finding these tasting exams. But they happen all the time. A couple times every year. I think now in Toronto and Vancouver, they're going to be having them. And there's also, when I was judging in November with Gordon Strong, and he was was talking about the Mead program and kind of dropped a couple hints that they were looking at sort of improving the Mead program by adding a additional rank. So, those who score 80 above will have a different designation, for example, whatever it ends up being, compared to those that scored 80 and below in their tasting exam.
Oh, neat. He's
Yes.
asking, Bjorn's also asking, do you have any recommendations or ideas for Brew Club BJCP connections near Vancouver? Since you were sending stuff all over Canada, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Van Brewers is one of the most active homebrew clubs in Canada and has a huge, probably the most BJCP mead judges out of all homebrew clubs. So definitely connect with them.
And that's what, Van Brewers, did you say?
Yeah, VAN.
VAN.
Brewers.
Van Brewers, okay. Got that, Bjorn?
Yeah.
AJ just typed. Bjorn says, which what brewers? She typed it in there, Bjorn. Dude, really? Oh, God. He put up a heart. It's like, oh, no, I got it. So, and I've been jumping all over, keeping track of the various pages I have to keep track of during this whole mess. So, did we already talk about honey varietals, Canadian honey varietals?
I don't think so. We only touched on it a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah. The first thing I'd say, I know AJ can probably say a lot more because it's very regional in Canada. It's,
it
the
does sort
honey
of depend
locator.
on how far you're willing to go and how much you're willing to pay. Because right now, I deal mainly with one apiary because I can afford it. And there's some other fancy stuff around there, but there's no way I can afford to make it into a mead. So pretty much I'm stuck with the spring, which is mostly clover, the fall, which is mostly goldenrod, and buckwheat. That's what I get access to.
Yeah, and that's right. And my understanding is that in Ontario, the way it works is that they have to, apiaries have to grade their honey. So the three main grades are white honey, which are going to be your clover and alfalfa, and that primarily comes from southwestern Ontario, sort of around the Windsor, Niagara corridor. And then your wildflower honey, which is going to be your sort of more late season, all season, depending on the apiary. And one of the difficulties with working with that honey in Ontario, and AJ, maybe you can back me up on this, is that it tends to have a very, very strong floral character, especially the late season wildflower honeys around here, on the point of being musty or dank. And part of that, is possibly, it's the flowers we have, and it's a very, we're in the Thousand Islands region and cottage country, and there's lots of lakes and water. But part of that too is because a lot of that ends up being melon dew honey, so taken from aphids, and so you get a lot of really, really strong character. And when I'm judging and I get like a sizer, even, a lot of meads that I'll come across and be like, oh, they used wildflower honey from Ontario. Like, no, like this does not taste very good.
Well, that's the thing. I've had some really delightful wildflower honeys from Ontario, from the small town beekeepers, but the big time beekeeper I work with, they take in excess honey from any of the small time ones that don't sell it at the farmers markets, and they'll incorporate it in whichever grade it happens to go into. But, predominantly what I'm dealing with is clover and goldenrod. So right. You've already got something different there, because I don't think we really have so much of the aphids going on around here, because, even just 2 hours drive away, we've got slightly different climates.
Exactly, yeah. And there's another category of honey that we have around here. It's called, can be sold as called golden honey. Golden wildflower honey, and basically what this is more sort of midsummer harvests of honey that are more golden in character, And around my region is a wine growing region around the Picton area. And there's a lot of fruit farms and apple orchards, and that golden honey ends up being very almost Tupelo with a lot of palm character.
Really?
And it's a honey that I almost if I'm going to use wildflower, it's the only wildflower honey I'll use.
You're going to start a stampede north of the border, dude. Do you know how awful the Tupelo crop's been for the last 8 years?
Well,
David Webb's probably already getting in his car and headed up there.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure what Tupelo tastes like, because I think that's one of the ones that I've missed at my tastings at the Mazer Cup.
Okay, I think I may have a gallon of it downstairs, AJ. If I do, I'll pot up a little bit and see if I can get it through customs to you.
It's so much easier if you just bring it yourself.
I know, right? I have to drive for 15 hours or 19 hours.
Hey, I missed the plane because of my alcohol.
David is going, yeah, he's already in his car. That's why he's only typing short things.
I got a spare
I'm gonna take the link off to my apiary from the website. I'm gonna hoard it all for myself.
Okay, we got another question in from the listeners here. New listener, Sergeant Warden. He says, or she says, since I don't know if Sergeant is a first name or designation, if all meads tested in the sort mead tests were tested. Oh, okay. Were all the meads tested within an 8-week period? And then there was a mention of testing at the 2-month mark.
Yeah, so 8 weeks, 2 months. So one of the goals of the experiment was to really test short meads. And I think for a home mead maker, for commercial mead makers, one of the advantages of short meads is, if you can get a lot of mouthfeel and flavor and a good quality product out of it, you're looking at, lower amounts of honey and a quick turnaround time. And so, the results of this experiment would be quite different if I tested the meads at 6 months, at 1 month, at 1 year. I would expect different results, just because some of the chemicals that the yeast are producing, or they have a life and changing over time. And the idea from the experiment was, can you produce kind of the 1 month mead or the 2 month mead from these yeasts? And, is there a big difference from using a wine yeast versus, the bomb? And from tasting a lot of the meads, and AJ can mention this, but they really did come out pretty similar. And definitely in terms of taste, it was really the aroma and some of the more subtleties that came out. They've definitely changed over time. I did save a couple bottles and have cracked into them. The ale yeasts at 1 month had, when I bottled after 1 month, and when I was bottling, I noticed that a lot of the ale yeasts, like 001, CBC1, 041, they all had like an ale character, like something if you left out an American light lager, and let it warm up and you smelt it, you get this sort of ale malty character to it, lager like character to it. And I was surprised that I was able to pick that up in most of the ales. But at 2 months, all of that sort of ale lager like character had disappeared. And I imagine too that when over time, some of that fruity character would, and esters from the yeast are going to dissipate. Because when I bottled, like, for example, 1056, it was just a bouquet of berries. But at 2 months, it was still fruity, but it didn't have that punch that it had at 1 month.
Okay. And Sergeant asked, didn't see all those results in the short article that he read and was wondering, is there more results to be published? And also asks, was that 2 months after bottling or 2 months after sending it out? Or
That was 2 months from pitch.
2 months from pitch, okay.
Right. So they all fermented within, let me just pull up here. They all fermented dry within 3 weeks. So I cold crashed them, bottled at 4 weeks, let them carbonate for a month, sent them around with enough notice that they were all evaluated within a week and a half time frame at 2 months. One of the things too, actually looking at this now, I forgot to mention was that when I was tracking the rate of fermentation of the ale yeast versus the wine yeast, the ale yeast had a much lower fermentation rate, much slower fermentation rate than the wine yeast. And so, for example, at 48 hours, most of the wine yeasts were at 2/3 sugar break, but most of the ale yeast were still at 1/2 sugar break. Again, it's this question, well, is that because it's the nature of the ale yeast, or because you fermented at a higher temperature? You know, if this was fermented at 62, would they all slow down at the same rate? But definitely some of that honey aromatic may have been kept in more with the ale yeast because of that slow fermentation. So.
Okay. He also asked, were they all carbonated?
Yes, they were all carbonated. But they didn't all carbonate to the same amount. So one of the things was that the final gravity on the between the different yeasts differed from anywhere from 0.998 to 0.996. And actually 1056 ended up at 0.995, which again could just be measurement. But there was a noticeable difference between the crossing of the yeast. And I think what I did when I primed them is I used priming sugar, and I gave them all the same amount of priming sugar. But if you ferment down to 0.995 and then prime it, you may not get the same level of carbonation as something that had conked out at 0.998 and primed it. And a couple of the evaluators definitely stated that they noticed sweetness not coming from honey, which I actually thought was one of the more interesting aspects of the experiment, because there could be potential differences. They have different flocculation rates. They're dormant at, the dormancy of different yeast may be affected. They may take longer to bottle condition, and the final gravity may influence it. So I didn't conduct a full experiment, and I wasn't even sure if I was going to post it on the site, but there is a full experiment coming up for it. Is testing different carbonation, sugar carbonation, sugars used for bottle conditioning and priming. So, for example, does like cane sugar versus dextrose versus, table sugar versus dextrose versus honey versus forced carbonating affect the perception of, a dry hydromel? And, when I did this for myself and gave the test to myself blindly, there was a huge difference. The table sugar had a lot more acidity. It was harder for the yeast to ferment it. The dextrose fermented more faster and more out, but didn't have as much acidity. The carbonation, forced carbonation, had a very it had a nice honey aroma. It didn't have that additional acidity. There's no sweetness there that wasn't coming from the honey. Whereas when I bottle conditioned using honey, I was getting a lot more honey aroma and more of a rounded acidity than what I was getting from the other sugars. And, so that's definitely actually sitting in my basement just waiting for me to show up at a beer competition and bug the organizers to do triangle tests. So so beware if you're a Canadian at a judging at a homebrew competition.
Well, some of these are really interesting, and it's one of those things where you never really know what the taste difference is by reading the descriptions until you've actually tasted and smelled it yourself. So honestly, I find a yeast test is definitely high up on my list of something to do myself, because you don't get the same thing from reading it. You really need to get it on your tongue.
Absolutely. I mean, smell is one of the best triggers of memory, right? And having had that experience, it's been valuable. And even if you're, that's why I really encourage people to join the BJCP program if they are homebrew mead makers and homebrewers, because what it does is it basically, it gives you a ton of information to study and gets all that information up front, but then you get all the experiences that follow. Like, even if you never go and judge at a homebrew competition, you'll still have the experience from your mead tasting. And, that is enough, I think, to improve, your home mead making skills. The other thing is, when I was looking to become a mead judge, I happened to kind of get contacted like a week before by one of the organizers and said, "Oh, we got a spot open in the beer judge. Do you want to become, you want to do the beer test too?" And I, wasn't initially planning on it, but I'm really glad I did, because what that does is bring you into the full BJCP stream, and it allows you, to collect points and increase in rank. And if you go to these homebrew competitions, you're going to be much more useful, because a lot of the categories are going to be beer. And it also gave me a lot better understanding of braggots. So, the base styles of braggots is what braggots are compared to. Like, there's a harmonious balance between, the beer and the honey, but also it's how well did you fit to that style. Is the bitterness the right level? Is the hops, appropriate? Hop character, is the malt character appropriate? Color, everything. That, for the BJCP, like, style is everything. So, having that introduction, is going to be very helpful for, understanding of braggots, even if you're just interested in mead.
Well, the thing I found doing your triangle tests was I just did not have the vocabulary to describe the differences I was tasting. I could taste the difference, but I couldn't tell you what it was. So I can definitely see doing something like this to at least give you the tasting experience and the vocabulary to be able to figure that out.
That's right. Yeah. And one of the things that, as a judge, the score sheets that you fill out actually have a full list of descriptors down the side of your score sheet. Acetaldehyde, DMS, etc.
But the thing is, if you've never tasted acetaldehyde, you might not know to apply that.
Right. And so in the surveys that I gave to people for the triangle tests, what I did is basically took like a BJCP score sheet and sort of hacked it up in Microsoft Paint And so I added a couple lines for people to sort of, what's your overall descriptor of aroma and flavor. But in terms of off flavors, I provided kind of check boxes with, did you perceive mineralness? Did you perceive, acetaldehyde, that is green apple character? Did you, so that, someone who's experienced in judging is going to have this sort of list in their mind. They'll be running through trying to think, okay, do I see this? Do I have this? Do I experience this? Whereas someone who is not experienced in judging not only doesn't have the vocabulary, but doesn't know the certain things to look for. And so in the surveys, I was happy that I did include that. I wasn't able to utilize a lot of that information in the article. One of the things is that not everybody filled that section out. I was able to get 100% completion on whether or not they correctly identified the triangle, the odd mead out in the triangle test, and their overall impression. But then when it came to the check boxes, it was pretty clear that people were just not filling them out. And I think that's one of the risks that you have when you do more than one triangle test. Whereas if you're just giving, one triangle test in a sitting, I think people are going to spend a lot more time with it. And this is another thing that comes to mind, is that one thing I've noticed is that if you just ask people which one the odd mead is, they don't take they do it pretty quick. But if you ask people, I want you to find the odd mead out and describe it to me, then they take a lot more time with it. And that's something I noticed between the first and the second experiment that we did.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and with the second experiment, if I could, I guess, jump to that.
Sure.
One of the things that I can just say quickly about the when I tested the acidity levels in that 5% Grunfell clone mead, one of the things that really came out from that is every single person who identified the odd mead out preferred the mead with acidity. And, it was, with the mead, people said there was more complexity, there was more brightness, it was cleaner, it tasted more like the cherry that they expected. It was fuller, more mouthfeel, whereas when there wasn't the acid, it was just sort of flat. There's more, the character doesn't pop as much. And that's something I noticed when I was at Sellerman's recently, that, they have these short meads, and there's a lot of acidity in them that provides that extra character. And especially when you give someone a mead and you say it's sour cherry, what do you expect? You expect the cherry flavor, but you also expect some acidity. And so getting that right kind of helped tie it all together, I think, for that particular mead, which is really interesting to see in the descriptors after the triangle test. One other thing, is there any other questions? Because there's one other thing I wanted to mention.
No more right now.
One of the things I noticed was that there was a nutrient off flavor in an initial experiment that came from the fact that I was trying to give the ale yeasts a high level of yan, just to provide like a common playing ground across all the different yeast types, similar to what Bill did in his experiment. The difference was because I was doing one batches and using Go-ferm, the Go-ferm ended up providing almost the more yan than was required just in the addition of the Go-ferm. And one of this really surprised me because, you know, I've been doing 1 gallon batches and 3 gallon batches of the same mead and trying to produce it consistently. And I was always having trouble with my 1 gallon batches that there was just that Go-ferm flavor to it. And I kind of, if you're a mead judge, what I recommend you do is do a 1 gallon batch and overdo your Go-ferm. Just do it once so you know what it tastes like after it's been fermented, because there's like a kind of like a, I call it an umami, but it's more of like a, it's a terrible way of saying it, but like a wet dog food character to it. Kind of like what kind of wet dog food smells like, and it's I'm pretty sure it's the like high level of amino acids that are in Go-ferm. And in these short meats, you know, you don't have as long as a fermentation, and these amino acids becomes very important later in fermentation. But the other thing is that things like the fact that, you know, whether it's a 4% mead or a 14% mead, people, if you're pitching the same amount and the same amount of Go-ferm, you know, the Go-ferm is going to provide like 90% of your yan in a short, that 4% mead, but only like 20% of your yan at that 14% mead. So it's really an issue with these 1 gallon batches if you're rounding up yeast packets, and if, you know, you're pitching the same amount of Go-ferm for different ABVs, because this isn't something I've just noticed in my mead making. I've noticed this in at least 2 commercial meads now that I know use Go-ferm and Fermate O, or a Go-ferm, Fermate K, and Fermate O protocol. And it's like, wow, that tastes like that mead that, you know, I added too much Go-ferm to. So in my own trying to figure out what was going on between my 3 gallon batches and my 1 gallon batches, you know, I took all the calculators and compared them across ABV levels and across volumes of must. And I've written an article on that about the fact that when you're making these short meads, you may want to take into account at least some amount of the Go-ferm and the contribution in the minerals and amino acids in the end that's adding to the must. The flip side of that is that if you do that mistake and you do find you have that off flavor, you could always just, you know, backtrack, take that into account, increase the size of your must, you know, restart fermentation, and should be able to clean up most of those off flavors.
Definitely a good recommendation for that.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you said that, I was thinking, have I ever seen anybody say that that's what they did? And all the times I've seen people go, oh my God, I put too much something, you know.
Well, expanding the batch is the natural solution to having overdone something, but it's not always an option.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that's come up for people who've tried to replicate the recipes of Grenfell Meadery, because like Ricky the mead maker, you know, he's got his style of mead making, his kind of craft mead, where he's, you know, fermenting super high temperatures, really low ABV meads, but they got a lot of character, a lot of flavor. But, you know, he says, you know, he's pitching at 5 grams of dry yeast per gallon. And he's not using Go-ferm, he's using Y yeast, Y nutrient. And people have tried to replicate his recipes with using sort of the Go-ferm protocol, just keep finding that it doesn't work. You get these brine flavors, you get that, just a completely different character. And part of that is, you know, the Y yeast versus the, you know, other organic nutrients, but it's also the fact that when you're pitching at that rate and you're not taking into account the Go-ferm contribution of mineral and yan, particularly combined with your water profile, it can really contribute these off flavors of brine and yeast nutrient off flavors. So anyway, if you're interested in that sort of more technical discussion, you can go read an article I got on that about tailoring nutrient additions with Go-ferm. But otherwise, you can just ignore me and just wait for some future experiments, and I'll try to prove it to you. So.
Well, I suspect what's going to happen is that a whole bunch of people are going to go and read it, and then we're going to get flooded with questions. So we'll have to bring you back to answer all the questions.
Well, I'd be happy to do that when I run more experiments, for sure.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, and I'm glad to see that there's experimentation going on. We need more of that in this industry because there's so little of it. I mean, there's a lot of experimentation happening like within the meaderies for their own stuff, but you don't see a ton of generalized stuff like that. Carvin Wilson just did one on when to add fruit in millimills. In fact, he did a talk at the AMMA conference about it, and there was quite a lot of people that were really into that too. In fact, AJ, did you make it to that one?
I didn't, and I really regret not having had a chance to taste that because
me too.
A lot of the people, I was told that a lot of the people did not manage to guess which ones were right, but there was a very definite marked difference between, whether the fruit was added in primary and secondary combination.
Yeah.
Certainly, there was. I was there for that presentation. There were 4 meads. 2 of them were very similar, with moles apart, and it really comes down to what fruit you're using as to when you'll add it. So, Carvin was advocating this kind of test every time you do a new fruit, or something along those lines, so you can choose what works for you better. Mm-hmm. Because it was surprising. Yeah.
He was using Marionberry, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the 2 that were very similar for that particular case, which situations were those?
I think they were half-half and a progressive feed of fruit through the ferment.
Okay, that makes sense.
Which sort of stands to reason as well.
Yeah, so you'd end up with that would be similar, and then you'd end up with something very different on either end if you would put it all in secondary or put it all in primary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I can imagine them all being very different, and then, depending on the fruit, which one you actually prefer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think preferred was one of the 2 that were very similar.
Okay.
It was, so not all in primary and not all in secondary was the preferred in the case of Marionberries, in the case of the way Carvin made it. But he also made it with very little effort involved. He didn't add acid to brighten it up. He didn't back sweeten the way he would have. There are a lot of things he didn't do to these meads. So perhaps if you're back sweetening, all in secondary is better. It really depends on what you're doing, and by changing only one factor when you're doing an experiment and controlling for it.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, though. You want to change only one factor at a time, but in this case, what you've done is you've done your batches to dial in which way you prefer the fruit, and then after that, you take each one of those batches and then do back sweetening and acidifying to see if that makes a difference in which one is the preferred. Because one of the ones that I did taste was where I can't remember whose one it was. I didn't actually attend the thing. I just got to taste some of the leftovers, but where they had just the mead, and then the mead after they'd acidified it, and then after they'd back sweetened it, and then after they'd acidified it. And I don't think I was the only one who actually preferred it just back sweetened, not acidified.
Yeah, they were very different, those 3.
Considering they were all the same base mead. Very, very different.
Yeah, the base mead was terrible.
Yeah, it was really uninspiring, and
Yeah.
I think the whole point of that particular one was how to perk up a meh mead,
Yeah. Yeah.
and showing by taste what the difference is with adding a little bit of acidity and a little bit of sweetness to it.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing I got from the part of the presentation I did see in that regard was they intentionally make the base mead like that, and then they back sweeten it, and then they acidify it. So it's not about, if they make a mead that is meh. That's actually what they're aiming for. They knew what they want. They wanted a very clean ferment.
Nice neutral.
It comes out boring, and then they fix it up. Yeah.
Something nice
Well,
and
and
neutral
that's-
to use as a base.
And especially if you're doing mead on a professional scale, you kind of want that because it's predictable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you do. In fact,
As opposed to just hoping you got it right this ferment and not having to play with it, right?
A lot of professional meaderies there are quite a few of professional meaderies these days that are, especially the smaller ones that don't have, a dozen tanks or what have you. They've got one giant tank and they make the base mead in that, and then that gets split across other containers, tanks, what have you. And then they make adjustments at that point. So they'll add herbs, or they'll add spices, or they'll add fruit, or whatever. And so they're starting out with a very, I guess you'd call it generic, because it's not designed to jump right out unless it's something that's based on a, really interesting varietal honey or something. But, a really special varietal honey, you're not going to generally add a whole bunch of stuff to it anyway, because you want that honey to shine. So, they're doing that and getting a lot more. So, the same basic kind of thing, so you can get that across the board level ferment.
Yeah, you only hope they do it right, because otherwise it'd be like, wow, that meat really tastes like that meat. Just
I know, right?
Tea added, or
like, wow, it tastes just like blah with cinnamon.
yeah, all their meats taste alike. I don't know why.
But they manage not to do that. I've had meads from, I don't know, probably 10 or 15 meaderies that do that. For at least some of their meads. None of them do it for all of their meads, but they'll have like a base mead that maybe does 3 or 4 different things that they're doing. And I've been impressed with the individuality of the meads, even knowing that it came from the same base. So, I was kind of impressed with that. Now, that's not to say that there aren't meaderies who are making like 6 or 7 varieties of the same mead plus the teeny little difference. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't had every one yet.
It is interesting, though, when you talked about that experiment at the Mazer Cup, because, one of the things that we were finding is that, just because you can tell a mead apart doesn't mean you're going to prefer it, or mean everybody's going to prefer one mead over the other. Almost all the yeast experiment, almost everybody could tell the difference, but then it was split 50-50. For the acid experiment, people weren't able to significantly tell the difference, but those who could, everybody preferred it. And I think, that just tells you that you should be a home mead maker, so you can make it the way you like it, right? So don't worry so much about what the judges say. Take it with a grain of salt if it's balanced, but balanced one way or another, right? So
yeah.
And in terms of the fruit, one of the interesting things that I've been finding, both as a mead maker and while judging, is not only when the fruit is added, but whether or not it's processed prior to adding. So there are certain fruits, so if I freeze fruit and add it, let's say to secondary. There are certain fruits where, it really won't matter, like raspberries just going to turn to mush anyway, right? Or whatever. But blueberries or currants, if you pull that fruit off too quickly, before those berries really have a chance to degrade, you get more like berry skin character and tannin than you do like the fruit acidity punch than if you, for example, mash the berries first, or and I know that's one of the experiments that I am going to do.
Fruit treatment?
Fruit treatment, yeah, and just comparing in secondary, if you keep the for example, blueberry whole, or if you put them through a food processor first, because I know I've definitely experienced it. as a home mead maker, playing with blueberries and currants. And I've also noticed in judging and be like, whoa, this tastes like blueberry skin, not blueberries.
Yeah, I find you have to pop the fruit. Even if you've frozen it, you still have to pop the fruit. So I'm constantly on the search for a potato masher that's got holes in it small enough that I can actually mash blueberries, or the red currants that I get, which are the size of peas.
Yeah, I have
Always on the hunt.
I have a KitchenAid that I just sort of whip it up once or twice just to sort of cut them in half.
I just got a bigger KitchenAid so I can do that kind of stuff. But yeah, they've got crosshatch style potato mashers that you can find. You just got to look in the antique stores or online that carries antique style tools, not antique. Well, tools,
technically, I work in a metal shop. I should be able to come up with something.
There
myself.
You go. You work in it, yeah. So take a screen with a really big square on it.
Well, I'd have to make it all out of stainless, though.
Yeah, well, yeah, but that's
just be a big old mess.
So basically, just make a crosshatch pattern with the holes small enough, and stick a handle on it, But
I have been known to use the pasta maker before. It does a fair job.
Which?
Oh, yeah.
The pasta.
Okay.
The pasta machine.
Yeah. You open it up full and then run them through, and it tends to normalize the size.
And then do you get blueberry colored pasta the next time you make pasta?
You clean it.
No, I actually clean my utensils.
Well, I'm thinking a pasta making machine, and I'm thinking, but there's like this crimpy thing in there that's really going to be hard to get all the guck out of, and no.
No, you dump it in a bucket of OxyClean.
Well, yeah, exactly. Same thing you do with all of your winemaking equipment.
Yeah, right? Gotta love OxyClean, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I use a food mill, but that doesn't work for things like cranberries. They're too hard.
Yeah.
It's one of those, every fruit is different, and you gotta pay attention to how you're processing all of them to be able to get the maximum out of it. Like, that's one of the things I like about Joe's Ancient Orange style is you just leave the fruit in until it sinks, then you've gotten everything out of it you possibly can. And I can hear Carvin cringing from here.
Yeah, I gotta head out soon.
Yeah, that's cool.
My wife is very tolerant, but I try to minimize my,
we
minimize
totally
as
get
much
it.
as possible.
Yeah,
but,
we appreciate it, and spending all this time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. And just on a final note, I just encourage people to conduct their own experiments, and even as simple as priming sugar, or just putting a batch, just for your own experience, and and consider posting it for other people, and hope that you've been inspired a little bit, and consider us and Got Mead and other outlets for that to share your information. And other than that, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks
Steven.
for coming,
Yeah,
Steve.
thanks for coming.
All right, cheers.
All right, later. Okay, that was super cool.
Yeah.
I hope this spurs some experimentation. I'm going to share everything from that site across the board on the social media for AMMA and Got Mead to let people know who maybe weren't listening tonight or whatever about it, so that he gets more.
One thing he didn't bring up that's really valid is sometimes you can definitely taste the difference, but you're never you don't know whether you like one better than the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
I've had that happen a couple of times where these are very definitely different, but honestly, I don't have a preference for them.
Well, and
they're both good.
Your tastes will change too. Like stuff that I thought was the bomb diggity 15 years ago are totally different from things that I think are the bomb diggity now. And part of that is I've learned more as I go, but also part of it is just my tastes have changed. What I like has changed. Flavors that I've discovered that I didn't know about before that I now really, really like, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm talking about just something so simple as I made back when everybody was all about, do you boil your honey, do you not boil your honey? I made a batch where I boiled one and I didn't boil the other, and I did the batches were exactly the same other than that. And yeah, one of them tastes and smells different from the other, but honestly, I couldn't tell you which one's actually nicer to drink. They're both pretty good. They're different, but they're both pretty good. So, you really got to get other people to help you with tasting stuff to calibrate your own sense of taste. And also, it's quite possible things are different, but you don't really have a preference.
Yeah, that's very
So,
true.
when you're talking about your statistical relevance, it's possible that there may not really be a difference in preference, even though there is a difference in taste.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
And it doesn't make it any less statistically relevant. It just, they're similar enough, or they're both likable enough. It may or may not. You may still be statistically significant without honest-to-God results,
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we're running up on time here, so we're going to let you guys know what's going on. April 4th, which is, tomorrow. Boss Meadery Boss Meadery in Wisconsin has Craig Bauman coming to play. April 13th, Groenfell Meadery has the Fancy Schmancy Cocktail Party with Silo Distillery. So it's kind of a mashup, making mead cocktails, and they're joining up with a distillery to do it. I really wish I lived up there because I'd totally go to that.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It's like I'll meet you there, right? We only have to get to the Northeast. All right,
Yeah.
April 14th, Starlight Meadery is going to be participating in the 7th annual Festival of Lights in the
Festival of Legends, I think.
sorry, Festival of Legends. Yes, thank you. Festival of Lights is at Christmas time. April 14th, St. Ambrose Cellars has Saldage coming to play at their place. April 21st, the Winemaker's Shop Mead competition is going on, and all of these items are linked on the paid post for the show for this episode. And then April 24th, my birthday, so if anybody wants to buy me a ticket to this, just joking. Boss Meadery has a mead pairing dinner up at their place or near their place, and there's a 4-course meal being served and paired with their meads. So that sounds like it'd be really interesting as well. So, and as always, if you want to get your event on Got Mead Live, let us know. Just send me an email at gotmead@gotmead.com with the date, a link, and what it is, and we'll get it up on the show for you. So
stop making us chase you down for it.
Thank you. Yes.
Free advertising.
Yeah, and also, Meaderies, just FYI, there's also a free event listing thing on both Got Mead and on the AMMA page. So, you could be like spreading the stuff around. Just saying. So, okay, and upcoming guests. Next week we've got Evan Himes with Dutch Gold Honey, and if you went to the AMMA Mead Conference, Evan did one of the breakout sessions on varietal honeys, and he had a varietal honey tasting with four different honeys? And then he also gave tastings of 4 traditional meads made by Sergio, made from those varietal honeys. So Evan's going to come on and talk a little bit about what they did with that, and what Dutch Gold's been up to, and what kind of honeys they've got, and tell us a little bit about what's going on in the honey industry. So those of you that got like burning questions like how come it's costing so much to get my honey per pound and things like that, this will be a good time to ask. Dutch Gold is one of the largest East Coast honey suppliers. So and yet they're still a family-owned company who provides a very high quality level of honey. So definitely worth coming to listen to it. And in fact, I may be getting a couple more honey. I think I'm gonna call all of our people. We had 3 different honey providers at the AMMA conference as vendors, and I think I'm gonna ask all of them to come on the show, one after the other, so that we can get some different perspectives. Dutch Gold's in Pennsylvania. Crockett's out in California, I think, and then there's one other one that came whose name escapes me at the moment, but I'll think of it shortly, is from another part of the country. So we'll get some ideas of what's going on around the country in honey. So that might be fun. And for those of you out there listening, I'd love to do a Women in Mead series. So besides AJ, who's kind of obvious, and who is a shoo-in, who else in Women in Mead Making should we have on the show? Let us know. Gotmead@gotmead.com. So that's all I got. But your dog's howling.
Yeah, that too.
I think it was...
Those are not my
sorry,
dogs.
that was my dog. I think you were talking about Thomas Huber from Bee Seasonal, Organic Honey Varietals.
Yes.
Was the other one?
Yes, that's it. Thank you. So yeah, I'm gonna get our honey folks on here, and and we'll get them talking about varietals and things like that. If I can pry her out of her very busy life, I'll even see if I can get Lori from Bee Folks.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah, she's got 5 kids, and of the 5 kids, 3 of them are triplets.
Good
That's
lord.
insanity.
Plus, she runs a honey company, and she works. Her honey company goes to a number of the Renaissance festivals in the eastern part of the country. So she lives a pretty busy lifestyle. I can barely get her on email, so we'll see. I'm not gonna promise anybody anything.
Well, and I think we've got a contact from, I think it's Scott Labs, who
Yes.
told us that they would be very happy to come on the show at some point. So we're going to try to get that scheduled too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, if there's somebody you want us to talk to, or somebody you'd like to see on, or if you know somebody who you think just has to be on the show, that's how we found Steven. AJ found him for us. So
Actually, he found me.
well, okay, he found AJ, but still, AJ got him to come on the show. So anyway,
Well, fair.
yeah, whatever. If you know somebody that you think really needs to be on here that other people need to hear from, then let us know. We want to know. I mean, come on, we can't think of all this stuff. But AJ says potato. God,
You're always reading the quiet stuff out loud again.
I know.
The stuff that really makes me laugh must be. It's in the rules. You didn't read that part of your contract? Oh my
Fine.
God.
Oh, in fact,
Read the fine print, dude. Seriously.
Damn it!
I think
Come
we
on, I
just
gotta take off my
read it.
glasses to read the fine print these
Yeah,
days.
there you go. I know, right? Then hold it really close to my face, or at the end of my arm. One of the two. I can never remember.
Yeah,
which.
it's just lovely being nearsighted and farsighted at the same time.
At the same time. Yeah, I know, right? So, all right, kiddies, we're gonna wind it up for this week. And sidebar. Oh, wait. Yes, Hamish.
No, carry on.
Oh. Then don't do that. Dang. This is the downside of having a private chat, is you never know what the hell. All right. So anyway, we'll see you guys next week, same time, same day, and we'll be talking with Evan Himes. And until then, make more mead. And we'll talk to y'all next week. Night.
Good
Bye,
night.
everybody.